In a 4:21 a.m. post on Truth Social, President Trump wrote, quote, "The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country." He promised a press conference at Mar-a-Lago at 11 a.m. No independent verification exists. The Venezuelan government says they don't know his whereabouts. Before we begin, this video is an educational and analytical discussion of geopolitical events. It reflects analysis and opinion based on publicly available information and does not promote violence, hate, or extremist ideologies. According to multiple outlets from Reuters to Al Jazeera to CBS, at approximately 2 a.m. local time on January 3rd, Caracas experienced at least 7 explosions. Low-flying aircraft were reported. The FAA immediately banned U.S. commercial flights from Venezuelan airspace, citing ongoing military activity. The U.S. Embassy issued a shelter-in-place order. Parts of southern Caracas lost power. These are hard facts corroborated across independent sources. The Venezuelan government has not confirmed Maduro's capture. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez went on state TV and said, quote, "We do not know the whereabouts of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores. We demand proof of life." Think about that carefully. They didn't say he's captured. They said they don't know where he is. That's a massive gap between the U.S. claim and the Venezuelan response. Since last year, the United States has positioned itself in the Caribbean with a military presence that analysts tell us is the largest in decades. CBS News reported approximately 15,000 U.S. troops in the region as of December 30th. 11 naval vessels, including the USS Gerald R. Ford, 5 guided missile destroyers, 2 cruisers, an amphibious assault ship, CV-22 Ospreys, and C-17s moved to Puerto Rico. B-52 and B-1 bombers conducting flights off Venezuela's coast. This wasn't a secret. Trump himself posted about the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. The Trump administration has been remarkably open about its objectives. In 2023, Trump himself boasted that during his first term, Venezuela was, quote, "ready to collapse," and that the U.S. would have taken it over and gotten all that oil. He said this publicly, not in a leaked memo, not in a classified briefing, in front of cameras to reporters. Let that sink in for a moment. The stated goal was not democracy promotion or regional stability. It was resource acquisition. Before this claimed capture, the U.S. had seized at least 2 oil tankers and announced a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil shipments. One tanker, the Skipper, was boarded in a video Attorney General Pam Bondi posted showing armed personnel descending from helicopters. They were imposing a naval quarantine, which under international law is an act of war. We know that Venezuela sits on the largest known oil reserves in the world. That is not debatable. What is debatable is whether that justifies the approach being taken. And this is where you have to start evaluating incentives. Beyond oil, Venezuela has an abundance of natural gas, gold, and critical minerals, including rare earths. The exact materials the Trump administration has identified as strategic vulnerabilities given China's dominance in those supply chains. Venezuela is also aligned with Iran, Russia, and China, which from a geopolitical standpoint places it in the crosshairs of this new Cold War framing. And you have a political opposition that has been cultivated over 20 years with direct ties to U.S. policymakers. When you look at the people driving this policy, you see Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, functionally the second most powerful person in the administration, and Stephen Miller as Homeland Security Advisor. According to multiple reports citing administration officials, they are pushing a hardline approach that merges the war on terror with the war on drugs. This is the Bush-era playbook being taken off the shelf, brushed off, and applied to Caracas. And that brings us to the so-called Cartel de los Soles. This is supposed to be the narco-terrorist organization that the Justice Department is using to build a legal case for intervention. But here is where I had to stop and do my own verification. What is this organization, really? When you dig into it, you find that even researchers at the International Crisis Group, an organization funded by Western governments, so not exactly a pro-Maduro source, have stated clearly that the Cartel de los Soles does not exist as a formal organization. It's a narrative construct designed to circumvent the fact that you can't legally target a sitting head of state for assassination under U.S. and international law. By rebranding Maduro as a drug lord rather than a president, they create a loophole to describe the involvement of Venezuelan authorities in drug trafficking. It is a label, not a verified operational entity. This matters enormously because it reveals the mechanics of how you build a case for intervention. You create a narrative framework that allows you to label a sovereign government as a criminal organization. Once you have done that, you can sidestep the traditional legal and diplomatic barriers that would normally prevent you from targeting a sitting head of state. It is a workaround, and it is effective if people do not look too closely. In late December, Trump publicly admitted the CIA conducted a strike on what he called a dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. He gave the CIA lethal authority. He said, quote, "I'm not saying it's true or untrue," when asked about land strikes, but added he wouldn't inform reporters anyway. This was telegraphing the punch. Now, what really crystallized this analysis for me was looking at the opposition figures the United States has been elevating. When Juan Guaido was appointed interim president in 2019, a man who had never even run for president, let alone won an election, it became impossible to take the democracy promotion argument seriously. This was about installing a favorable government, full stop. Fast forward to today, and you have Maria Corina Machado, who has been positioned as the face of democratic resistance. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And when you look at the lobbying effort behind that award, you see direct involvement from Marco Rubio and other U.S. officials. This was not an organic honor. It was a strategic credibility boost. When Machado speaks to U.S. corporate audiences, she is remarkably candid about her intentions. At the America Business Forum in Miami, sitting between engagements with Donald Trump and various administration officials, she laid out a vision that is about as far from democratic socialism as you can get. She talked about opening Venezuela for foreign investment, privatizing state assets, and creating what she described as a $1.7 trillion opportunity for American companies. She specifically mentioned opening all upstream, midstream, and downstream oil operations to foreign firms. She told Bloomberg there's a $1.7 trillion opportunity in oil, gas, gold, and infrastructure. She said Chevron would be best positioned for the boom. This is not the language of someone who plans to nationalize resources and redistribute wealth. This is the language of someone who plans to auction off her country's patrimony to the highest bidder. And when she was asked directly about her relations with China, Russia, and Iran, she called Venezuela a bridgehead for U.S. adversaries and promised that a transition to democracy, by which she meant her administration, would dismantle those relationships and turn Venezuela into, quote, the strongest security ally of the United States. What stands out to me here is the transparency of it all. This is not happening in the shadows. Machado openly states that liberating Venezuela will mean Cuba and Nicaragua will soon be free as well. That for the first time in history, the Americas will be free of communism. This is a domino theory for the 21st century, and it is being articulated by the very people who stand to benefit from it. You have Chevron, which already has operations in Venezuela and would be perfectly positioned to expand if Maduro falls. You have the Venezuelan oligarchic families who lost power when Chavez nationalized the oil industry. These are people like Machado's cousin, Vanessa Newman, who comes from the Caracas socialite class that used to fly to Miami for shopping trips and describe middle-class Venezuelans as people who could afford to travel internationally. She wrote this in her own book. This is not speculative. This is her own description of her upbringing. You also have the Halverson family, Norwegian Venezuelan elites with connections to right-wing think tanks in Washington. Leopoldo Lopez, another opposition figure, is their cousin. These are not working-class revolutionaries. These are the people who want to restore the pre-Chavez order, where Venezuela's resources flowed to a small elite and foreign corporations rather than social programs. When you map out these connections, the incentive structure becomes impossible to ignore. This is about who controls the $1.7 trillion in resource wealth that Machado talks about. It is about whether that wealth stays under state control, even a flawed, corrupt state, or whether it gets privatized and open to international investment. From a geopolitical standpoint, the stakes are even higher. Venezuela is one of Iran's closest allies in the Western Hemisphere. It buys Russian military equipment. It is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. For a U.S. administration that frames its foreign policy around great power competition, allowing Venezuela to remain in the China-Russia-Iran orbit is unacceptable. This is not about democracy. This is about spheres of influence. Removing Venezuela from the China-Russia-Iran orbit delivers a strategic blow to all three adversaries simultaneously. It demonstrates that the Monroe Doctrine is back in force. It warns Nicaragua and Cuba they're next. Now, I know many people watching are thinking, hold on, Maduro is undemocratic, his election was disputed, the economy collapsed, millions fled. Why shouldn't the U.S. remove him? Yes, Venezuela is experiencing an economic catastrophe. Inflation, shortages, migration, those are real human costs. But here's the question I keep coming back to. If the goal is to alleviate suffering, why has the U.S. imposed sanctions that independent studies show have killed tens of thousands of people? A 2020 report by economists Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs documented that U.S. sanctions killed an estimated 40,000 Venezuelans by blocking medicine and food imports. The UN Human Rights Council has repeatedly condemned the sanctions. If the U.S. wanted to help Venezuelans, it would lift the sanctions, not bomb the country. And once you say it's okay for powerful countries to remove leaders they dislike, you open Pandora's box. Saudi Arabia can justify invading Yemen. Russia can justify Ukraine. China can justify Taiwan. The principle of sovereignty is the only shield smaller nations have. Erode it, and you get a world of constant, unresolvable conflict. My take is this. If you care about Venezuelan democracy, you should be demanding free elections monitored by the UN, not supporting a US-backed coup that installs a puppet who promises to sell the country to ExxonMobil. The two are not the same. What you're watching is not just about Venezuela, it's about the revival of the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump officials are calling this the Monroe Doctrine, a play on the Monroe Doctrine, but updated for resource competition and great power rivalry. The Economist ran a piece titled War Looms in Venezuela as Trump tests an America's first doctrine. The parallels are intentional. In the 1820s, Monroe warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. In the 2020s, the doctrine has flipped. It's now about preventing Latin American countries from having relationships with China, Russia, or Iran. Machado made this explicit when she told the America Business Forum that Venezuela has become a bridgehead for U.S. adversaries and that her government would dismantle this and turn Venezuela into the strongest security ally of the United States. This is geopolitical cleansing. It's the idea that the Americas must be ideologically and strategically pure, aligned with Washington or else. And here's what makes this particularly dangerous. China is Venezuela's largest creditor. Russia has armed Venezuela with advanced systems. Iran has deep intelligence and military ties. When you threaten to remove Venezuela from that orbit, you're not just attacking Caracas, you're attacking a network of relationships that took decades to build. You're telling Moscow and Beijing that their investments and partnerships mean nothing. You're inviting retaliation elsewhere. Maybe in Syria, maybe in the South China Sea, maybe through cyber operations. The question is whether Washington has calculated these risks or whether, as has happened before, the desire for a quick win blinds them to the long-term costs. Look, I've been analyzing U.S.-Latin America relations for years. I've studied the 1954 Guatemala coup, the 1973 Chile coup, the 1989 Panama invasion, the 2002 Venezuela coup attempt, the 2019 Guaido recognition. Each time, the pattern is similar. Exaggerate the threat, cultivate opposition, build legal pretext, apply economic pressure, use military force or the threat of it, install a friendly government. But this is different. Never before has a U.S. president publicly claimed to have captured a sitting head of state and removed them from their country. Even when Noriega was taken in 1989, it was after a full-scale invasion and his surrender. This claim, if false, is a level of fabrication that crosses a new line. If true, it's an act of aggression that violates the most fundamental principles of international order. I think Maduro is in U.S. custody or en route to U.S. custody, but the parties are negotiating the terms of announcement to manage the transition and prevent civil war. The Venezuelan government's statement that they don't know his whereabouts could be a face-saving way of saying he's no longer in command, but we can't admit that yet. The opposition's immediate coordination suggests they were prepared for this moment. This would explain why Trump made the claim so early. He wants to lock in the narrative before Caracas can shape it. It explains why the Venezuelan response is so measured. They're buying time. And it explains why the opposition is already briefing U.S. media. They're ready to assume power. Whether you're in the U.S., Latin America, or anywhere else, this matters because it redefines the rules of international relations. If this stands, if the U.S. can remove a government by force and face no consequences, then the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. That's not a world with rules. That's a world with rulers. If you care about international law, you should be alarmed. If you care about sovereignty, you should be outraged. If you care about democracy, you should demand proof that the replacement is actually chosen by Venezuelans, not selected by Marco Rubio and approved by ExxonMobil. We cannot conceive of a world where Latin America has agency, where countries can choose their own partners, where resources are not automatically considered U.S. property, so we default to the old patterns: coups, invasions, sanctions, regime change. If you found this analysis useful, I'm going to be tracking this situation closely. In the coming days, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get updates as this story develops. Like and share if you think more people need to understand what's actually at stake here, and drop a comment with your perspective, especially if you're in Venezuela or have family there. Your voice matters in this conversation. Thanks for watching. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.